I was standing in my empty apartment watching Marcus pack the last of his things into boxes labeled fragile in his careful architect's handwriting when my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Just wanted you to know that Marcus and I are together now. I hope you can be happy for us. The audacity hit me like a physical force, not because she had taken him, but because she thought she had won something worth winning. I set my phone down without responding and turned back to watch Marcus struggle with a box of his photography equipment. 3 months ago, this scene would have shattered me. 3 months ago, I would have begged him to stay, would have promised to change, would have convinced myself that our 5-year relationship was worth salvaging. But that was before I discovered what it felt like to be truly valued by someone who understood that love wasn't a negotiation. You sure you don't want any of these kitchen gadgets? Marcus asked, holding up the pasta maker we'd bought during our Italian cooking phase last summer. We barely use them. Keep them, I said, my voice steady. I'm sure Sophia will love playing house with you. He flinched at the casual way I said her name, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just the crystalline clarity that had settled over me the day I finally understood who he really was. The story of Marcus and me began the way most doomed relationships do, with potential that was never quite realized. We met during graduate school, two ambitious 20-somethings who looked good together on paper and even better at department mixers. He was studying architecture, I was pursuing my master's in environmental engineering, and we bonded over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of building sustainable communities. For 5 years, I convinced myself that our relationship was the mature, stable kind that others envied. Marcus was reliable in the way that a well-maintained appliance is reliable. He showed up when expected, performed his designated functions, and rarely surprised me. He remembered anniversaries, split bills fairly, and introduced me to his parents with appropriate enthusiasm. When he proposed last Christmas, surrounded by both our families in his parents' living room, I said yes because it felt like the logical next step in a carefully plotted timeline. The ring was beautiful, a vintage Art Deco setting with a modest but well-cut diamond. It was my grandmother's, he'd explained later, sliding it onto my finger while his mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She would have loved you. What I didn't realize then was that Marcus approached our relationship the same way he approached his architectural projects, with careful planning, attention to detail, and absolutely no room for spontaneity or genuine emotional risk. He loved me the way he loved a well-executed blueprint. I met his specifications, fulfilled my designated role, and rarely challenged his vision of how our life should unfold. The cracks began to show 6 months ago, though I'd been willfully blind to them for much longer. Marcus had started working late more frequently, claiming that his firm was pursuing a major commercial contract. He'd come home distracted, checking his phone constantly and offering vague explanations about client meetings and site visits that somehow always seemed to coincide with times when I needed him most. When my father had his heart attack in March, Marcus was stuck in a planning session and couldn't drive me to the hospital. When I got the promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years, he celebrated with a perfunctory dinner at our usual restaurant, spending most of the evening texting someone about urgent project details. When I suggested we finally book our honeymoon destination, something we'd been putting off for months, he claimed we needed to wait until his work situation stabilized. I told myself that this was temporary, that every couple went through phases where career pressures created distance. I made excuses for his distraction, covered for his absences at social gatherings, and gradually shrank my own expectations to accommodate his diminishing emotional availability. The beginning of the end came on a rainy Thursday in April. I had left work early, feeling optimistic about surprising Marcus with his favorite Thai takeout, and maybe finally having an uninterrupted conversation about our wedding plans. His car was in the driveway when I arrived, along with another car I didn't recognize, a sleek black Audi with a fitness center sticker on the rear window. I found them in our living room, bent over Marcus's laptop, ostensibly reviewing architectural drawings. She was beautiful in the way that personal trainers often are, all defined muscles and perfect posture, with the kind of effortless blonde hair that suggested expensive salon visits. When I walked in, they sprang apart with a guilt that was immediately obvious, though Marcus quickly recovered with introductions. "Babe, this is Sophia Martinez. She's the wellness coordinator for the new fitness complex project. Sophia, this is my fiancé, Claire. Sophia smiled with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to charming her way through uncomfortable situations. Claire, Marcus talks about you all the time. Congratulations on the engagement. That ring is gorgeous. She was wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and I noticed the way her hand lingered on Marcus's shoulder when she leaned over to point at something on the screen. More tellingly, I noticed the way Marcus seemed to vibrate with an energy I hadn't seen from him in months. We were just going over the wellness center specifications, Marcus explained, closing the laptop with unnecessary firmness. Sophia has some really innovative ideas about integrating mindfulness spaces with traditional fitness equipment. I set the Thai food on the coffee table and studied them both. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes, and Sophia was radiating the kind of nervous excitement that comes from being somewhere you're not supposed to be. But what struck me most was the realization that I wasn't devastated. I was relieved. Finally, the indefinable wrongness of our relationship had a name and a face. How nice, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Will you be staying for dinner, Sophia? Oh no, I should head out, she said quickly, gathering her things with theatrical efficiency. Early training session tomorrow, but Marcus, think about what we discussed regarding the meditation pods. I really think we're onto something special. After she left, Marcus and I ate our pad thai in silence, the air thick with unspoken tensions. He made a few attempts at normal conversation, asking about my day, mentioning a movie he thought we might see over the weekend, but his heart wasn't in it. His phone buzzed constantly throughout dinner, and each time he checked it, I watched his face light up in ways it hadn't for me in months. That night, lying next to him in bed, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for weeks. Marcus was having an emotional affair, if not a physical one. And more importantly, I didn't care enough to fight for him. The revelation should have been crushing, but instead, it felt like waking up from a long, unsatisfying dream. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to honestly examine our relationship without the rose-colored glasses of obligation and shared history. What I saw was two people who had stayed together out of habit and convenience, rather than genuine love. Marcus had never truly seen me, not the parts of me that were messy or complicated or required more than surface-level attention. He loved the idea of me, the role I played in his carefully constructed life plan, but he had never been curious about my inner world or invested in my individual growth. We had built a relationship based on compatibility rather than connection, and now that someone had sparked his actual passion, the hollow foundation was impossible to ignore. The next few weeks passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Marcus continued his project meetings with Sophia, each one lasting longer than the last. He started going to her fitness classes, claiming he needed to understand the client perspective for his designs. He downloaded meditation apps, bought workout clothes, and began using phrases like mindful movement and intentional living that sounded ridiculous in his precise, corporate voice. I watched this transformation with anthropological fascination. Marcus, who had previously considered yoga a waste of time and meditation hippie nonsense, was suddenly embracing every aspect of Sophia's wellness-centered lifestyle. He was becoming a different person, or perhaps revealing who he actually was when genuinely inspired. What struck me most was how little his obvious infatuation hurt. I felt like a scientist observing an interesting but ultimately irrelevant experiment. The man I had planned to marry was falling in love with someone else, and my primary emotion was curiosity about how long it would take him to work up the courage to leave me. It was during this period of emotional detachment that I met David. I had started going to a small coffee shop near my office, needing a space that wasn't contaminated by memories of Marcus and me. The place was cramped and slightly shabby, with mismatched furniture and a bulletin board covered in local art announcements and yoga class schedules. It was the opposite of the sleek, Instagram-worthy cafes that Marcus preferred, which made it feel like neutral territory. David was usually there when I arrived, always at the same corner table with a stack of papers and a laptop covered in environmental advocacy stickers. He was a public interest lawyer specializing in water rights, and he worked with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely believed in what he was doing. We started with polite nods, progressed to brief comments about the weather or the quality of the coffee, and eventually settled into the kind of easy conversation that happens between two people who have no agenda beyond enjoying each other's company. He was nothing like Marcus. Where Marcus was tall and lean with sharp angles, David was more solidly built, with laugh lines around his eyes and hands that showed he wasn't afraid of manual labor. He wore clothes that were practical rather than fashionable, drove a hybrid that was more reliable than impressive, and talked about his work with the kind of passion that Marcus reserved for discussing square footage and construction materials. "You're an environmental engineer?" he asked one morning after I'd mentioned a particularly frustrating project meeting. "That's incredible. I've been working on a case involving groundwater contamination from industrial farming, and I keep thinking how much easier it would be if I understood the technical side better." His genuine interest felt revolutionary after years of Marcus treating my work as a pleasant but ultimately secondary consideration. David asked follow-up questions, remembered details from previous conversations, and seemed to find my professional expertise genuinely impressive rather than merely tolerable. We started meeting intentionally, ostensibly to discuss the intersection of environmental law and engineering, but actually because we both looked forward to those conversations in ways that had nothing to do with professional networking. David was easy to talk to, genuinely funny, and possessed of the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own values and living by them consistently. More importantly, he was interested in me as a complete person. He asked about my family, my hobbies, my opinions on everything from urban planning to science fiction novels. He remembered that I was trying to perfect my grandmother's bread recipe and brought me a book about traditional baking techniques. He noticed when I was stressed and offered practical help rather than generic platitudes. When I mentioned that I was engaged, he nodded politely and didn't pry, but I could see the flicker of disappointment that crossed his face. It was the first time in months that I'd felt truly seen by someone, and the contrast with my relationship with Marcus was stark and undeniable. "He's a lucky man," David said simply, and I felt a pang of something that might have been regret if I hadn't already begun the process of emotional excavation that would eventually free me from a fundamentally incompatible partnership. The catalyst, the moment that crystallized everything I'd been avoiding, came on a Saturday in May. Marcus had been out at another client meeting with Sophia, supposedly visiting potential sites for the fitness complex expansion. He came home 3 hours later than expected, flushed and energetic in a way I hadn't seen since our early dating days. "How did the site visit go?" I asked, not because I cared about the answer, but because I was curious how creative his lie would be. "Really well," he said, avoiding eye contact while hanging up his jacket. "Sophia has this vision for incorporating outdoor workout spaces that could really set this project apart. We ended up walking through this whole nature preserve area, discussing how to blend the built environment with natural landscaping." His phone buzzed and he checked it immediately, his face lighting up with that now familiar expression of secret joy. When he looked up and realized I was watching him, the guilt flickered across his features before being replaced by defensive irritation. "What?" he asked, and there was a challenge in his voice that I'd never heard before. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for, the opening that would allow me to address what we'd both been pretending wasn't happening. I could have confronted him about Sophia, demanded explanations, fought for our relationship with the passion of someone who still believed it was worth saving. Instead, I felt that crystalline clarity settle over me like armor. "Nothing," I said calmly. "I'm glad you had a good time." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly expecting a different response. When I didn't elaborate, he muttered something about needing to shower and disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with the absolute certainty that our relationship was over. That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus sleep and finally allowed myself to imagine a different life. I thought about David's laugh, the way he listened with his whole attention, the passion in his voice when he talked about protecting natural resources for future generations. I thought about what it would feel like to be with someone who was genuinely excited about my presence, rather than merely comfortable with it. For the first time in years, I let myself want something more than the safe, predictable future that Marcus and I had planned. I wanted passion, curiosity, genuine partnership. I wanted someone who would choose me, not because I fit neatly into their predetermined life plan, but because they couldn't imagine their life without me in it. The next morning, I began the quiet, methodical process of extracting myself from a relationship that had been over long before either of us had the courage to admit it. I started with the practical details. I opened my own bank account and began transferring my portion of our shared savings. I researched apartments in neighborhoods I'd always wanted to explore, but that Marcus had dismissed as too inconvenient or not our style. I made appointments to change my emergency contacts at work, updated my insurance beneficiaries, and quietly began separating our intertwined financial lives. Marcus, absorbed in his courtship of Sophia, noticed none of these changes. He continued his pattern of late meetings and weekend site visits, each absence making it easier for me to imagine life without him. When he was home, he was distracted and eager to leave again, checking his phone constantly and making vague references to exciting developments in his professional life. I found his transparency almost endearing. Marcus had never been good at deception. His guilt was written across his face in bold letters, and his attempts at casual conversation about his feelings for Sophia were laughably obvious. He started leaving wellness magazines around the apartment, began doing yoga videos in our living room, and replaced his usual business podcasts with meditation apps. "I've been thinking about incorporating more mindfulness into our daily routine," he announced one evening while scrolling through what was obviously Sophia's Instagram feed. "There's real value in intentional living practices." "Absolutely," I agreed, not bothering to point out that he'd mocked these same concepts just months earlier. "You should definitely pursue whatever makes you happy." My encouragement seemed to confuse him. He'd clearly expected resistance, jealousy, or at least some acknowledgement of the obvious subtext of his newfound interests. When I responded with genuine support for his personal growth, he looked almost disappointed. 2 weeks into my secret preparations, I ran into David at our usual coffee shop. He was reading a legal brief, occasionally making notes in the margins with a pencil that was worn down to a stub. "Working hard?" I asked, sliding into the chair across from him without invitation, a liberty I wouldn't have taken even a month earlier. "Always," he said, looking up with that smile that made something warm unfurl in my chest. "Water rights don't protect themselves. How's the wedding planning going?" I hesitated, realizing that this was the first time anyone had asked me about my engagement in weeks. Even my own friends had stopped bringing up wedding details, perhaps sensing my lack of enthusiasm for the topic. "It's complicated," I said finally, and David's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine concern. "Want to talk about it?" And suddenly, I did. I told him about Marcus's obvious infatuation with Sophia, about the months of emotional distance and distraction, about the growing realization that we'd been staying together out of habit rather than love. I explained my relief at finally understanding why our relationship had felt so hollow and my surprising lack of devastation at its impending end. David listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and offering the kind of perspective that only comes from someone who isn't emotionally invested in maintaining comfortable illusions. "It sounds like you've already made your decision," he said when I finished. "The hard part now is following through." "The hardest part," I corrected, "is that I don't think it's actually hard at all. Shouldn't I be more upset about losing 5 years of my life?" "Maybe those 5 years taught you exactly what you don't want," David suggested. "That's not a loss. That's valuable information." We talked for another hour, and when I finally left to go home, I felt lighter than I had in months. David had listened to my entire story without once suggesting that I should fight harder for my relationship or give Marcus another chance. He'd simply accepted my assessment of the situation and trusted me to know my own mind. That evening, I found Marcus in our bedroom, staring at his phone with an expression of frustrated confusion. "Everything okay?" I asked, though his distress felt academically interesting rather than personally concerning. "Sophia's being, I don't know, weird," he said, running his hands through his hair. "She keeps saying she doesn't want to interfere with my relationship, but then she sends these messages that seem like more than professional." I sat down on the edge of the bed, studying his face. "What kind of messages?" "Like today, she sent me this photo of a sunset from her balcony with a caption about finding beauty in unexpected moments. And yesterday, she asked if I was happy with my life choices. It feels like she's testing something, but I can't figure out what." The irony was almost funny. Marcus was frustrated that Sophia wasn't being more direct about her interest, while simultaneously being completely oblivious to the fact that I was planning my exit from our relationship. He wanted her to make the first move so he could respond without having to take responsibility for ending our engagement. Maybe she's interested in you, I said calmly, but she's trying to be respectful of the fact that you're engaged. Marcus looked at me sharply, clearly surprised by my directness. What makes you say that? Marcus, you've been infatuated with her for months. You light up whenever she texts, you've completely changed your lifestyle to match her interests, and you spend more time thinking about her than you do about me. If I can see it, she definitely can. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language, clearly not prepared for this level of honesty. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but there was no conviction in his voice. Yes, you do, I replied gently. And that's okay. You can't help who you're attracted to. Claire, Marcus, I interrupted. What would you do if you weren't engaged to me? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I watched him struggle with the implications, his face cycling through confusion, guilt, and something that might have been relief. I would never, he began. I'm not asking what you would never do, I said. I'm asking what you want to do. For the first time in months, Marcus looked directly at me, really looked, and I could see the exact moment he realized that I was offering him permission to want something else. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly. You won't, I assured him, and meant it completely. You'll hurt me more by staying out of obligation than you would by leaving for love. That night, we had the most honest conversation of our entire relationship. Marcus admitted his feelings for Sophia, his confusion about the sudden intensity of his attraction to someone so different from me, and his guilt about essentially conducting an emotional affair. I told him about my own growing certainty that we were fundamentally incompatible, my relief at finally understanding why our relationship had always felt like work rather than joy. So what do we do now? He asked as we sat on opposite ends of our couch, the engagement ring sitting on the coffee table between us, like evidence of a crime neither of us had meant to commit. We end this honestly, I said. We acknowledge that we both want different things and we let each other go find them. Marcus nodded slowly, and I could see the guilt warring with relief in his expression. I'm sorry, Claire. You deserve so much better than this. I deserve someone who chooses me enthusiastically, I agreed, and so do you. So does Sophia. We spent the next hour discussing logistics with the same careful attention to detail that Marcus brought to his architectural projects. Who would keep the apartment? Him, since he could afford it alone and I wanted a fresh start. How we'd handle our shared belongings, amicably with no attempts to punish each other through petty property disputes. When we'd tell our families, together, explaining that we'd simply grown apart and wanted different things. It was the most mature conversation we'd ever had, and it confirmed everything I'd realized about our fundamental incompatibility. Even in ending our relationship, we approached it like a business partnership being dissolved rather than a love affair coming to a tragic conclusion. 2 days later, I signed the lease on a sunny, one-bedroom apartment in the neighborhood I'd always loved but that Marcus had deemed too artsy. It had hardwood floors, enormous windows, and a kitchen that was designed for someone who actually enjoyed cooking, rather than just reheating takeout. Marcus moved out the following weekend, taking his carefully cataloged possessions and leaving behind only the furniture we'd agreed I could keep. He was polite and efficient, treating the move like any other logistical challenge that required his organizational skills. As I watched him load the last box into his car, I felt nothing but gratitude that we'd both finally been honest about what we wanted. He looked almost giddy with relief, checking his phone constantly for messages from Sophia and practically vibrating with excitement about his newly simplified romantic situation. You sure you're okay with all this? He asked, clearly hoping I would confirm that I was fine so he could stop feeling guilty about his eagerness to start his new life. I'm perfect, I assured him, and for the first time in years, I meant it completely. That afternoon, I called David. The engagement is off, I said without preamble when he answered. Oh, Claire, I'm sorry. Are you okay? I'm more than okay, I said, looking around my empty apartment and feeling nothing but possibility. I'm free, and I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me. Somewhere that's not a coffee shop. The pause that followed was pregnant with potential. I would love that, David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But only if you're sure you're ready. I don't want to be a rebound. David, I said, you could never be a rebound. You're the reason I finally understood what I was missing. We had our first official date 3 days later at a small Italian restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and sustainable farming practices. David arrived with flowers, not roses, but a bouquet of wildflowers that he'd picked from his own garden. We talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, and when he walked me to my door, he asked permission before kissing me goodnight. It was everything my relationship with Marcus had never been: spontaneous, passionate, and built on genuine mutual fascination rather than compatible life goals. Over the next month, I threw myself into creating the life I'd always wanted, but had been too afraid to pursue. I redecorated my apartment with bold colors and interesting textures that Marcus would have found too busy. I signed up for a pottery class, started a vegetable garden on my tiny balcony, and reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the years of making my life smaller to accommodate Marcus's preferences. David and I fell into an easy rhythm of coffee dates, weekend hikes, and long conversations about books, politics, and our shared commitment to environmental conservation. He introduced me to his friends, a diverse group of activists, artists, and public interest lawyers who welcomed me with the kind of warmth that comes from people who are genuinely excited about new additions to their community. The contrast with Marcus's social circle was stark. Where Marcus's friends had always treated me as an accessory to his presence, David's friends were interested in me as an individual. They asked about my work, my opinions, my experiences, and actually listened to my answers. "You're different," David told me one evening as we walked through the farmer's market, selecting ingredients for dinner. "Not different from who you were, different from how you seemed when you were engaged. Like you were wearing a costume that never quite fit." He was right. I felt like myself for the first time in years. Curious, opinionated, passionate about things that mattered to me rather than things that mattered to Marcus. I laughed more, took up space more confidently, and stopped apologizing for having preferences that might inconvenience other people. It was during this period of personal renaissance that Sophia made her move. I was having lunch at a downtown cafe when she appeared at my table, looking nervous but determined. She was even more beautiful up close, with the kind of effortless style that suggested either natural confidence or very expensive personal styling. "Claire, I'm Sophia Martinez. We met briefly at your apartment a few months ago." "I remember," I said, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Please sit." She settled herself carefully, clearly having rehearsed this conversation. "I wanted to talk to you about Marcus." "What about him?" "He's... We've been spending a lot of time together since your engagement ended, and I wanted to make sure you're okay with that. I know this must be hard for you." I studied her face, trying to understand what she was really asking. There was genuine concern there, but also something that looked like guilt or uncertainty. "Sophia," I said gently, "Marcus and I ended our engagement because we realized we weren't right for each other. His feelings for you just helped us see what was already true." "But you were together for so long," she pressed. 5 years is a significant investment. I don't want to be the reason you lost that." "You weren't the reason," I assured her. "You were the catalyst that helped us both understand what we actually wanted. I'm grateful for that." She looked skeptical, as if my lack of devastation was somehow suspicious. "Really? You're not angry with me?" "For what? Being the person Marcus wanted to be with? For making him happy in ways I never could?" I shook my head. "Sophia, you did us both a favor." "He said you'd say something like that," she admitted. "But I couldn't believe it until I heard it myself. Most women would hate me." "Most women would hate the person who took something valuable from them," I agreed. "But you didn't take anything valuable. You helped me realize that what I had wasn't worth keeping." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of our conversation, Sophia looked genuinely relieved. She was clearly a good person who had been carrying unnecessary guilt about falling for someone who was technically unavailable but emotionally checked out of his existing relationship. "I hope you find someone amazing," she said as we prepared to leave. "Marcus is lucky that you handled this with so much grace." I already found someone amazing, I told her, thinking of David waiting for me at our coffee shop with a new book he thought I'd enjoy. And Marcus is lucky that he found you. 2 weeks later, the text arrived. Just wanted you to know that Marcus and I are together now. I hope you can be happy for us. I read it while standing in my apartment, watching Marcus pack his final belongings, and felt nothing but amusement at the timing. Sophia thought she was delivering news that would devastate me, unaware that I was already living my better life. Marcus finished with his boxes and straightened up, looking around the space that had once been ours and was now completely mine. I think that's everything. Good, I said, slipping my phone into my pocket without responding to Sophia's text. I hope you two are very happy together. Claire, he said, and there was something wistful in his voice. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd tried harder? I considered the question seriously. I think we would have made each other miserable for a few more years before eventually arriving at the same conclusion. This way, we both get to be happy sooner. He nodded, though I could see he was struggling with the ease of my acceptance. Marcus had always needed validation that he was important, that losing him would be a tragedy for the people he left behind. My obvious contentment with our separation probably felt like a judgment on his overall worth. For what it's worth, I added, I think you and Sophia are genuinely compatible in ways we never were. She brings out parts of you that I never even knew existed. Relief flooded his features. Really? Really? You're more yourself with her than you ever were with me. That's not an insult to either of us. It's just the truth. After he left, I called David. Want to come over and help me christen my Marcus-free apartment? I'll bring wine, he said immediately, and Thai food and terrible movies. Perfect. I love you. I love you too. The words came easily now, without the careful consideration and strategic timing that had characterized my relationship with Marcus. David and I had said it for the first time just 2 weeks earlier, and it had felt as natural as breathing. Not because the emotion was casual, but because it was completely honest. That evening, as David and I sat on my couch sharing pad thai and laughing at a ridiculous romantic comedy, my phone buzzed with another text from Sophia. I saw that you read my message but didn't respond. I hope you're not upset. I showed the text to David, who raised an eyebrow. What do you think she wants? Probably permission to feel good about taking Marcus, I said. Or maybe she's worried that I'm planning some kind of revenge. Are you? My revenge is being happy, I said, curling up against David's side. There's nothing more devastating to someone who thinks they've won a competition than realizing there was no competition to begin with. David laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. Should I be worried about your ruthless streak? Only if you ever give me reason to use it against you. Never, he said seriously. You're too important to risk. The final confrontation came 3 months later at a coffee shop downtown. I was meeting a potential client to discuss a sustainable water management project when I spotted Marcus and Sophia at a corner table. They were clearly having an argument. Sophia's face was flushed with frustration, and Marcus had the defensive posture he always adopted when he felt criticized. I finished my meeting and was walking toward the exit when Sophia called my name. Claire, wait! I turned to find her approaching alone while Marcus remained seated with an expression of obvious discomfort. I need to ask you something, Sophia said, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Were you and Marcus having problems before we met? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. I could see Marcus watching us from across the cafe, clearly dreading whatever truth might emerge from this conversation. Why do you ask? Because he talks about you constantly, she said, frustration bleeding into her voice. Our relationship, your relationship, how different we are, how much easier things were with you. It's like he's trying to turn me into some idealized version of you, or maybe turn himself back into who he was when he was with you. I looked past her to Marcus, who was now staring at his phone, with the intensity of someone trying to disappear through the force of will. The irony was almost perfect. He'd left me for Sophia, but he couldn't seem to stop comparing their relationship to ours. Sophia, I said gently, Marcus and I stayed together for 5 years because we were compatible on paper and comfortable with each other. But we were never passionate, never challenging, never really interested in growing together. We were safe. And now he's with someone who makes him feel alive, but he's scared of that intensity. He's probably trying to recreate the safety he had with me while keeping the excitement he found with you. Sophia's face crumpled with recognition. That's exactly what it feels like. Like he wants me to be exciting, but not too exciting. Passionate, but not too demanding. That's not your problem to solve, I told her. Marcus needs to decide who he wants to be and what kind of relationship he actually wants. You can't manage his emotional growth for him. Did you try? She asked. When you were together, did you try to fix him? For years, I admitted. I made myself smaller so he would feel bigger. I convinced myself that love meant accepting someone exactly as they were, even when they weren't willing to meet me halfway. And now? Now I'm with someone who thinks I'm incredible exactly as I am and who challenges me to be even better. Someone who chooses me every day, not because I'm convenient or safe, but because he genuinely can't imagine his life without me. Sophia looked back toward Marcus, who was still avoiding eye contact. I don't think he knows how to do that. Maybe not, I agreed, but that's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to teach him. What would you do if you were in my position? I would ask myself whether I wanted to spend the next 5 years hoping someone would become the partner I deserved, or if I'd rather find someone who was already that person. Sophia nodded slowly, her expression shifting from frustration to something that looked like resolve. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for caring enough to ask. I left them there and walked to my car, feeling the satisfying weight of complete closure. Marcus would probably always compare his future relationships to ours, not because what we had was particularly special, but because it represented the last time he felt completely in control of his romantic narrative. With Sophia, he'd discovered what it felt like to want someone desperately, and that vulnerability terrified him. That evening, I told David about the encounter while we cooked dinner together in my tiny kitchen. He listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions or offering observations that helped me process the strange experience of counseling my ex-fiance's new girlfriend through the same relationship patterns that had ultimately destroyed our engagement. Do you think they'll make it? David asked, chopping vegetables with the practiced efficiency of someone who actually enjoyed cooking. I think Marcus will try to make Sophia into a more exciting version of me, and Sophia will either accept that diminished role or decide she deserves better, I said. Either way, it's not really about love. It's about Marcus trying to have security and passion without the vulnerability that comes with real intimacy. David paused in his chopping to look at me. Is that what we have? Real intimacy? The question should have felt loaded, considering we'd only been together for 4 months. But instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world to consider. Yes, I said without hesitation. We see each other clearly, we challenge each other, and we choose each other anyway. That's terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Terrifying? David asked, moving closer until he could wrap his arms around my waist. Absolutely. With Marcus, I always knew that if I became inconvenient or difficult, he would eventually leave. So I made myself convenient and easy. With you, I know you'd stay even if I became difficult, which means I have to take responsibility for actually being the person I want to be. David considered this, his expression serious. That's a lot of pressure. The best kind of pressure, I assured him. The kind that makes you grow instead of shrink. We finished making dinner, a complicated pasta dish that would have annoyed Marcus with its messiness and multiple steps, and ate it while discussing David's latest case and my upcoming presentation to the city council about sustainable stormwater management. It was the kind of evening I'd once thought was impossible. Intellectually stimulating, emotionally intimate, and completely unstressed. After dinner, we settled on my couch with books and wine, each of us reading but occasionally sharing interesting passages or observations. The comfortable silence felt revolutionary after years of relationship that required constant maintenance and careful management of Marcus's moods and insecurities. My phone buzzed with a text, and I glanced at it automatically before setting it aside. Everything okay? David asked, noticing my slight frown. Sophia again, I said, showing him the message. I broke up with Marcus tonight. Thank you for helping me see what I deserve. How do you feel about that? I considered the question honestly. Relieved for her. and maybe a little sorry for Marcus, though not sorry enough to regret anything. Think he'll try to get you back? Probably, I admitted. Marcus doesn't handle rejection well, and losing 2 women in 1 year is going to damage his self-image. He'll probably convince himself that our relationship was actually perfect, and I was the one who got away. David's expression darkened slightly. And if he does, then I'll remind him that he chose to leave and I chose to move on. Some decisions can't be undone, and some opportunities don't come twice. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and David and I stared at it for a moment before I declined the call. Too soon, I told David. He needs time to process what happened before I can have a rational conversation with him. But Marcus had never been good at accepting boundaries, and over the next 3 days, he called repeatedly. Each voicemail was longer and more desperate than the last, progressing from confusion. Claire, I don't understand what happened with Sophia. To anger. I can't believe you told her to break up with me. To something that sounded dangerously close to pleading. Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we gave up too easily. On Thursday evening, he appeared at my apartment building, buzzing my intercom repeatedly until I finally answered. Claire, I need to talk to you, please. I could hear the desperation in his voice, and part of me, the part that had spent 5 years managing his emotional needs, wanted to invite him up and help him process his feelings. But the larger part of me, the part that had learned to prioritize my own well-being, recognized this as exactly the kind of situation I needed to handle differently. Marcus, I'm not available for that conversation right now, I said calmly into the intercom. You need to go home and figure out what you want without using me as a sounding board. But Sophia said you told her to break up with me. Sophia asked me for advice about your relationship, and I told her the truth. What she did with that information was her choice. What truth? His voice was getting louder, and I could picture him in the lobby, attracting attention from my neighbors. That she deserves someone who chooses her wholeheartedly, not someone who's trying to recreate a previous relationship with better accessories. The silence that followed was long enough that I thought he might have left. Then, is that what you think I was doing? Marcus, what do you think you were doing? Another long pause. I don't know anymore. Everything is so complicated now. It doesn't have to be complicated, I said gently. You just have to decide what you actually want instead of trying to want what you think you should want. I want to come upstairs. I want to talk to you face to face. No, I said firmly. I'm not available for that. I'm not your emotional support system anymore, Marcus. You need to find other people to help you process your feelings. But you understand me better than anyone. I understand the version of you that you were when we were together, but that's not who you are anymore, and it's not who you should be. You need to figure out who you are without me. I hung up the intercom and turned to find David watching me from the kitchen doorway. He'd been giving me space to handle the conversation privately, but his presence felt reassuring rather than intrusive. That sounded hard, he said, coming over to wrap me in a hug. It was, I admitted. Part of me still wants to fix his problems for him. 5 years of that pattern doesn't disappear overnight. But you didn't. But I didn't, I agreed, feeling proud of the boundary I'd maintained. I chose us instead. David pulled back to look at me. Us? This relationship, this life we're building together. I'm not going to jeopardize that by becoming Marcus's therapist. I love you, David said simply, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones. I love you too, more than I ever loved Marcus, and in completely different ways. Different how? With Marcus, love felt like work, like something I had to maintain and protect and constantly prove. With you, love feels like coming home to myself. That weekend, Marcus tried a different approach. He sent flowers, not to me, but to my office, with a card that read, I'm sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I can't stop thinking about what we had. My coworkers were curious and sympathetic, assuming the flowers were from David and that we'd had some kind of argument. When I explained that they were from my ex-fiancé, the reactions ranged from romantic, he's trying to win you back, to practical, you should probably tell your boyfriend. I called David immediately. Marcus sent me flowers at work, I said without preamble. Expensive ones. Very expensive ones. How do you feel about that? Annoyed that he's bringing drama to my workplace and slightly embarrassed that my coworkers now think my love life is more complicated than it actually is. Is it complicated? Not for me, I said firmly. I know exactly what I want and who I want it with. Marcus is the one making it complicated by refusing to accept that we're over. What do you want to do about it? I want to send him one final message that makes it clear this behavior needs to stop. And then, I want to take you out to dinner to celebrate the fact that I'm confident enough in our relationship to handle this situation without drama. I'll make reservations, David said. And Claire, I'm proud of you for handling this so well. That evening, I sent Marcus a text message that was longer than any communication we'd had since our breakup. Marcus, I need you to stop contacting me. What we had was real and meaningful for the time we were together, but it's over. I'm in love with someone else now, and I'm building a life that doesn't include you. Continuing to reach out to me isn't fair to either of us, and it's preventing you from moving forward. I wish you happiness, but I can't be part of your journey to find it. Please respect my boundaries and give us both the space we need to live our separate lives. His response came within minutes. I understand. I'm sorry for not accepting this sooner. I hope you're happy, Claire. You deserve to be happy. The simplicity of his acceptance surprised me. Perhaps he'd finally realized that his persistence was only highlighting how little he actually understood about what I wanted or needed. Or perhaps Sophia's departure had forced him to confront the pattern of taking people for granted until they were no longer available. Either way, I felt the final piece of emotional residue from our relationship dissolve. Marcus was now truly in my past, a chapter that had taught me valuable lessons about what I didn't want, but no longer had any claim on my present or future. At dinner that night, David raised his wine glass in a toast. To closure, he said. To new beginnings, I countered. To the woman who taught me that love should feel like freedom instead of obligation. To the man who showed me what it feels like to be chosen every single day. We clinked glasses, and I felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had navigated a complicated situation with integrity and emerged stronger on the other side. 6 months later, I ran into Sophia at the farmer's market. She was alone, looking healthier and more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. Her hair was shorter, and she was wearing clothes that looked comfortable rather than carefully curated for maximum impact. Claire, she called out, approaching with genuine warmth. How are you? I'm wonderful, I said, and meant it completely. You look great. How are you doing? Really well, actually. I started my own wellness consulting business, and I'm dating someone new, someone who doesn't need me to be anyone other than exactly who I am. That's incredible. I'm so happy for you. Thank you for that conversation we had, she said seriously. It changed everything for me. I realized I was trying so hard to be perfect for Marcus that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be myself. What happened with him, if you don't mind me asking? He spent about a month trying to convince me that we could make it work if I was just more patient, more understanding, more willing to compromise. But I finally understood that he didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience for his life who would occasionally provide input but never challenge the fundamental script. And now I'm with someone who thinks my opinions are fascinating rather than inconvenient. Someone who wants to know what I think about everything, not just the things that relate to his interests. That sounds familiar, I said, thinking of David waiting for me at home with the Sunday crossword puzzle and ideas for our upcoming hiking trip. Marcus asked about you, actually. A few weeks ago, he wanted to know if I thought you'd ever consider getting back together with him. What did you tell him? That you'd moved on to someone who appreciates what he was too distracted to notice, and that he should probably do the same instead of staying stuck in regret about relationships that ended for good reasons. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. But I think he's finally starting to accept that nostalgia isn't the same as love, and that some chapters of life are meant to end so better ones can begin. We parted ways with genuine warmth, two women who had briefly been positioned as rivals but had instead become allies in the shared project of refusing to settle for relationships that diminished us. That afternoon, I told David about the encounter while we worked in our shared garden, a small plot of land we'd rented together as both a practical project and a symbol of our commitment to growing something beautiful together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Marcus had been different? David asked, carefully transplanting tomato seedlings with the same attention he brought to everything he cared about. Sometimes, I admitted, but not in a wistful way, more in a grateful way, like wondering what would have happened if I'd never learned that I could want more than just compatibility. And what's the answer? The answer is that I would have married him and we would have had a perfectly adequate life together. I would have convinced myself that I was happy, and he would have convinced himself that he was satisfied, and neither of us would have ever discovered what we were actually capable of feeling. David looked up from his planting. That sounds terrifying. It was terrifying. I almost settled for a life that would have been fine instead of holding out for one that's extraordinary. Is this extraordinary? David asked, gesturing to our small garden, our dirt-stained clothes, our simple Saturday afternoon project. This is the most extraordinary thing I've ever experienced, I said without hesitation. Not because it's dramatic or exciting, but because it's exactly what I want. Because I chose it freely, and I wake up every day grateful that I get to choose it again. David set down his trowel and pulled me into a kiss that tasted like sunshine and possibility. I love our ordinary, extraordinary life, he murmured against my lips. I love that we built it together, I replied. I love that we keep building it together. That evening, as we sat on our small balcony sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset, I thought about Sophia's text from months ago. Just wanted you to know that Marcus and I are together now. I hope you can be happy for us. At the time, she'd thought she was delivering devastating news to a woman who had lost something precious. She couldn't have known that she was actually informing me that two people I cared about had found each other at exactly the moment when I was discovering what I'd been missing my entire adult life. The irony was perfect and complete. Sophia had tried to steal my fiancé, unaware that I had already moved on to someone infinitely better. But more than that, she'd given me a gift she couldn't have intended. The final push I needed to stop settling for good enough and start demanding everything I deserved. Marcus was a good man who had taught me valuable lessons about compatibility, compromise, and the difference between loving someone and being in love with them. Sophia was a good woman who had helped us both realize that passion and comfort didn't have to be mutually exclusive if you found the right person. But David was the person I'd been unconsciously searching for my entire life. Someone who saw me completely and loved me specifically, who challenged me to grow while accepting me exactly as I was, who made me feel both utterly safe and constantly surprised. As the last light faded from the sky, David reached over and took my hand. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about how grateful I am for every wrong turn that led me to you, I said, including the 5 years I spent with Marcus, and the drama with Sophia, and all the times I almost settled for less than this, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. They taught me to recognize the difference between a relationship that looks good on paper and one that feels good in my soul. David squeezed my hand. Here's to terrible first drafts that teach us how to write better stories. Here's to the final draft, I countered, and the lifetime we get to spend editing it together. Later that night, as I lay in bed listening to David breathe beside me, I thought about the woman I'd been when Marcus first proposed, eager to please, willing to compromise, convinced that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered fondly but could never go back to being. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a gradual process of remembering who I was beneath the layers of accommodation and adjustment I'd built up over years of trying to be the perfect girlfriend. David hadn't changed me. He'd simply seen me clearly enough that I couldn't hide from myself anymore. My phone buzzed with a text, and I checked it out of habit. The message was from an unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately. Claire, this is Marcus. I know you asked me not to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I'm starting therapy. I finally understand some things about myself that I should have figured out years ago. I hope you're well. I read the message twice, feeling nothing but quiet satisfaction that he was taking responsibility for his own emotional growth. A year ago, I would have felt obligated to respond with encouragement and support. 6 months ago, I would have felt guilty for not wanting to help him process his realizations. Now, I simply felt proud of both of us for doing the work necessary to become people capable of healthier relationships. I deleted the message without responding and turned back toward David, who was sleeping peacefully beside me. In the morning, we would wake up and make coffee together and read the newspaper while planning our day. We would work in our garden, take a long walk, maybe visit the art museum that had a new exhibition on sustainable design. It would be a perfectly ordinary Sunday, and it would be exactly the life I wanted. The woman who had almost married Marcus out of convenience and social expectation felt like a character from someone else's story now. I was grateful to her for the lessons she'd learned and the courage she'd eventually found, but I belonged entirely to the life I'd built with David, a life based on choice rather than obligation, passion rather than compatibility, and the daily miracle of being loved exactly as I was, while being inspired to become even more than I'd imagined possible. In the end, Sophia had been right about one thing. She had stolen my fiancé. What she hadn't realized was that by doing so, she'd freed me to find my soulmate. And for that, despite everything, I would always be grateful.